Welcome to this little bit of a chat here. We missed a long anniversary this year, so we did something a little bit more special. But yeah, we're back in full swing, and we are busy with a little series called Early. What did the earliest followers of Jesus believe? Okay, so just a very quick recap. Is there any way that we can assess or have a glimpse at what the earliest followers of Jesus actually believed? Or at least snapshot of some of their core beliefs. Now, following, we are not talking about the Gospels. We are talking the Gospels, at least 30 years before the earliest Gospel. We are talking about a period, even earliest New Testament canonical writings, which is the early writings of Paul, which is dated to around 50 AD. So we're talking about the period between Jesus's life and things. So the answer is yes. There's a way to assess to some degree, with some probability, some of the things that the earliest Christians or followers of Jesus, they wouldn't have been called Christians by then. They were basically like a Jewish sect at that point, what they would have believed. How do we do this? Well, scholars have, over the last couple of over the last century or so, they've realized that there are some pre-literary material inside the writings of the New Testament. So what is that? That is material that was used by the New Testament writers as a tool. So that would mean that these writings, or let's call it material for now, existed before Paul have written, and therefore most probably did not originate with our earliest writer of the New Testament writings, Paul. So how do we identify these? Well, there's certain criteria. I'll name them very, very quickly. Number one, these portions of material in the Testament seems very structured, poetic, hymnal. Secondly, they contain words that the writer doesn't use anywhere else. Thirdly, they would contain theological ideas that are, I wouldn't say foreign, but that they often differ from the theological ideas. We'll encounter one of them today, that, for instance, the writer that uses this material has. In other words, when I use a poem of a poet that wrote before me, before I write my letter, and I include that poem to prove a point, most of the poem might agree with what I'm trying to bring across, but there might be little pieces in that poem with which I don't necessarily agree. And if you had to evaluate that, or if you had to read all of my writings, you'll see, hey, wait a minute, this particular part of the poem doesn't really fit Francis' overall idea of life. That's one of the ways we identify these pieces of material as being pre-literary, in other words, before the writer wrote. Okay. So it's different words, different ideas. And there's also then the idea that this pre-literary material we find in the New Testament can stand on its own, like a little poem could stand on its own if you take them out of their context. And lastly, once you take them out of the actual writing, it seems like the writer could also exist kind of on its own. That's a simple way of how scholars identify these pieces of material. Good morning, Sharon, from Cape Town. So we've done two of these. We've done the one in Romans and the one in Corinthians. And today we are starting with our final one. So today, hopefully, we could do this in two sessions. I want to do a broad summary of what we've found, because at the end of the day, we want to session say what is probably the core belief. What was probably the core beliefs of the earliest followers of Jesus, and we're going to do that by then summarizing the findings we get from all three of these particular portions. But today we're dealing with our third one, and it's found in Philippians 2, from verse 6 to 11. So Paul's writing to the Philippians. We know that this is one of the undisputed writings of Paul. Paul loved the Philippian church, and he is encouraging everyone to have the same mind as was in Christ. And then he engages this piece of, which we now believe to be pre-literary material, to tell people, basically, it seems, that they need to be humble because Jesus was humble. That seems to be the point of Paul introducing this little portion here. Okay, so let me read it for you. I'm going to read from verse 6. And And this is where scholars believe this pre-literary poem or creedal material starts. Listen to it. It says, who, being in the form of God, did not regard being equal with God something to grasp after. I'm reading from the King James, but the last little line, not from the King James, because the King James is terribly confusing in this line. So let me just read that again, just a side note. Who, being in the form of God, did not regard being equal with God something to grasp after, but made himself no reputation, and he took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in the fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death of the cross. So this is understood to be the condescension. This is Jesus humbling, going down, right? Coming down, humbling himself unto death on the cross, basically. And then the second part, the second half of this material is about God then lifting him up. Verse 9. Wherefore God has also highly exalted him. That word highly means over, super exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name, that the things in earth and the things under the earth. So here's a huge promotion happening here. And that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Kurios, Lord, right? He's in charge, to the glory of God the Father. Okay, so I've got a monkey visiting me. Hopefully he'll stay away. So this is the little portion that we're going to be investigating today. It has basically two halves. Within each half, there's three stanzas, and each stanza has three lines. So the first one is condescending. It's a coming down, a humiliation, a humbling. And then the second one is an exaltation. Now, we've seen this idea of exaltation in some of the earlier or some of the other literary materials that we've looked at. It seems to be something that's very much part of the very early Jesus followers believed. They believed that Jesus was exalted. At some point, something happened, and he was, we can use the word promoted. He went up in rank of some sort. Now, as you already will know, that doesn't fit well with the idea of the Trinity. The Trinity is the very core of the Trinity states that Jesus was never promoted, but that he's always been equal to God. Okay, so it's important to know this. The point of all of this, of course, at the end is to show or to come to the conclusion, basically, that the earliest of Jesus' followers do not believe the same way exactly like we do today. And it's okay that that can be the case. I grew up believing that everyone believed the same from the very beginning until the very end, but it just doesn't seem to be the case. All right, back to the passage. This passage does indeed have a poetic and a rhythmic feel to it. Scholars have set out the poetic lines in different ways. The Greek has no preferred layout, of course, but we will use the layout that I've mentioned, the two halves, each with three stanzas in them like this, and each stanza has three lines within it. So it's rather almost double the size of anything we've investigated up until this point. And then we're going to be using that as our method of looking into this little piece of material and seeing what we can learn from it. So the first half begins by identifying the subject, who. This, of course, refers to Jesus. And the second half begins with wherefore or therefore. So the first half talks about the condescension of Christ, how he became down. Now we'll talk about the two different interpretations. Either came down from heaven or came down by humbling himself. And he becomes human. He dies as a human in obedience to God. But the second half of this poem, I'm going to call the poem from here on, talks about an exaltation. In other words, after he dies and humbles himself, God exalts him, right? And God raises him to an even higher, a highly exalted, meaning a higher level than what he even had before, and gives him this very, very high status as a result or as a reward for his humbleness and his willingness in obedience to die. Okay, so this seems to be, to most scholars then, to be pre-Pauline. In other words, Paul didn't invent this. Paul used this. It was in circulation before, and Paul is using it when he's writing to the Philippian church. And it is basically a poem a praise psalm, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, about the condescension and then the exaltation of Jesus Christ. And it is something that predates Paul. Now, the positives for us as Christians is this is evidence that Christians very early on believed in these things. These are not things that Paul invented. A lot of cynical people have very cynical views about Paul, that Paul was basically a con artist. I do not believe any of that. I believe Paul was sincere. And I think these type of pre-literary things that he uses kind of tells us that Paul is not inventing things. This is the common shared belief amongst Christians even before the time of Paul. So it's a great apologetic, of course, but with this comes also the other side of the coin, is that it does seem that some of these things that are earlier than Paul does not agree with Paul's view, and also does not agree with later Trinitarian or Orthodox views, the views that we might be holding on to today. So basically then, this is not something that Paul composes on the spot, right? But rather something he already knows, something known in the churches possibly, that he chooses to include in this letter to the Philippians. There are several reasons for this line of thought. So here we go now with the criteria on why scholars believe that this is pre-Pauline. Number one, the portion seems to be self-contained, a self-contained poetic unit rather than prose-like. So this is the first criteria, and it seems to fit that criteria quite well. Secondly, we have a number of words, including some of the key words, and we've seen this pattern before, used in this passage that Paul doesn't use anywhere else. Now, some of the key concepts or words in this passage is the idea that Jesus was in the form of God. This word form Paul uses nowhere else in his early writings, which tells us that it looks like he lent the material from somewhere else. Form of God and form of man are the two phrases that this word is contained in within this little thing. But Paul doesn't use it anywhere else in his writings. It's a pretty important part of this poem, and we're going to be talking about that because there's a lot of debate on what that actually means. Secondly, the phrase to be grasped after, which is also a very important part of this poetic piece of material. Key feature, which we're also going to be talking about, but this also Paul never uses anywhere else, not even in his normal writing. So the point is just simply that this poem contains words, phrases that Paul doesn't use anywhere else. It's another indicator that this is pre-Pauline. In other words, Paul didn't really compose this, but he did write it down, just to clarify. So the absence of these key words in Paul's other writings is an indication that he's quoting this passage that was written earlier by someone else. Okay, number three, some of the key concepts of this passage you're not going to find in Paul's other writings. This is, for instance, the idea that Jesus was in God's form before becoming human. This is not something you're going to find. I know this might be surprising to you, but it's just not something that you're going to find. You're not going to find Paul saying anywhere else Jesus was in God's form. You're just not going to find that. Especially before he became human, of course. Number two, that he had open to him the possibility of grasping after divine equality before becoming human. In other words, this is something you're not going to find in Paul, the idea that Jesus had the possibility before becoming human to actually grasp equality with God. Like, where does that come from? You might ring a little bell in the back of your mind. This sounds like Adam, and that's an important point we'll get to. But there's nowhere else where Paul expresses this type of idea. And then lastly, that Jesus became human by emptying himself. It's not a phrase or an idea that you find anywhere else in Paul. So number three, basically just saying there are phrases and ideas in here that you don't find in the other writings of Paul. It's part of the evidence to show that this is pre-Pauline. Okay, lastly, the poem doesn't really fit into the context of this letter to the Philippians very well. Okay, I'm not going to read this, but I'm just going to try and explain this. Paul is trying to say to people that they need to humble themselves and serve one another, as Jesus humbled himself and served us. To show this, he says, have the same mind as Christ. Then he quotes the poem, but unfortunately for Paul, the poem ends with a reward of exaltation for servanthood, which is not necessarily a good look for Paul, because he obviously doesn't want people's motivation. Well, we think he doesn't want people's motivation for servanthood to be a later reward of exaltation over your people you are serving. Nonetheless, it's just an indicator that this is something Paul uses to apply to a specific part of his argument, and because it comes from the outside, it doesn't apply to the entire argument. Okay, a little bit complicated, but not too much. The point of all of this is simply to show this is pre-Pauline, is something Paul pulls in and uses. Now we're going to move to the interpretation. And I want to take my time with this because it's incredibly important. And I want to recognize the fact that some of you might not feel that this is very important information, or would rather want an encouraging message. But actually, this stuff is absolutely crucial for understanding what to make with the Bible and how to apply it to our lives. And although it's just a small puzzle piece of the entire thing, I believe it's absolutely crucial. I wouldn't be spending my time on this at the risk of people saying, oh, that's not important. I'm not interested in that. I wouldn't be doing that unless I was absolutely convinced that it's critical. So there are two interpretations for this poem that we find in Philippians. All right. Scholars are divided. Most traditional scholars have a certain view, and then there are other scholars who don't. And then I know atheists that agree with conservative scholars on this. And then I know critical scholars that don't agree with the atheist or the conservative scholar. So there are two ways to understand this poem. I'm going to start with the first interpretation. Let me start with this first interpretation. This is the interpretation I think is more likely. I have my reasons for saying that, but this is not the traditional interpretation of this poem. Most conservative Christians, and you yourself, as I was reading through this poem, you had a picture in your mind. You already believe that you understand what this is about and exactly what's going on. For most people, this is a poem about the Incarnation. This is God becoming flesh and then becoming God again, or God becoming flesh, dying, being resurrected, and going to heaven. Because it's condescension and then exaltation. But there's a number of problems with this, and it doesn't fit well with the historical context either. As we've seen from the previous pre-literary portions, there was this idea, it seems, that early Christians did not necessarily believe that Jesus was divine until he was exalted. In other words, he was a fully human Messiah born of the seed of David. And then later on, he was exalted to become divine, whatever that would mean to us, because it can mean a lot of things. Anyway, so let's go to the first interpretation, which is the one I feel is more likely. Okay. Some scholars find it difficult to believe that a pre-Pauline poem, possibly dating as early as 40 CE, could already be celebrating the incarnational understanding of Christ. Now, the reason why this is difficult, because all the other early data points to a non-incarnational. So what is incarnation? Incarnation is God becoming human, right? That's incarnation in simple terms. And it seems like all the earliest data that we have for the followers of Jesus we don't see that anywhere in there. We see that they believed it was human that became God. Jesus was human that became God. For that reason, scholars are skeptical of an interpretation of this portion that leads to incarnation. All right, so due to the understanding that the earliest followers of Jesus were, in a sense, adoptionist, we've discussed this, and if you go back to the previous sessions, I've done a whole session just on adoptionism, but it's basically the idea that Jesus was adopted to be the Son of God and divine. This seems to be, this idea of God becoming flesh, it seems to be a very high Christology for so early on. So their particular interpretation of the poem is that it is related by comparing Jesus to Adam, right? Okay, so I've never seen it in this way until I come across the explanation, but it seems very compelling. So in this interpretation, Jesus is basically understood to be fully human, like the other adoptionist ideas, like Adam in a sense, but the second Adam. Now we know that Paul speaks about the second Adam, and so it could be that this poem suits him well because it's his kind of idea. But anyway, unlike Adam, who grasped. So what happens in the Garden of Eden? Adam, through Eve, of course, the human race, let's call it that, whichever way you're viewing it, they grasped for equality, right? They grasped the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because when they eat it, they believe, the snake tells them, they'll be like God. All right, so it's a grasping for equality with God. So this interpretation says that Jesus is compared to Adam here, but he is different from Adam. Because unlike Adam, who grasped for that equality with God, Jesus doesn't do it. He doesn't grasp for the equality with God, but Jesus is different. Jesus is faithful and obedient. In other words, he doesn't grasp, he just keeps on doing what he's supposed to be doing unto the place of death. So you have this huge contrast between Adam and Jesus. Adam grasps for equality and immortality, you could say, and then dies. Well, Jesus chooses to obey until death and is then resurrected, right? Okay, so here in this interpretation, Jesus is seen as the second Adam, but the one who gets it right. Jesus then was in the form of God in the same way that Adam was in the form of God, or the Hebrew words is translated for us in English as in the likeness of God. So this interpretation says the term form of God here simply means in the likeness of God, in the way that Adam was in the likeness of God. So in other words, Jesus was also in the likeness of God. So it doesn't mean that he was divine necessarily, or that he was God himself. It just means, like Adam, he was the image of God in the same sense. Right. So just like Adam and Eve were not equal with God, so Jesus too was not equal with God. Otherwise, how could he grasp for it, right? So that this portion says he didn't grasp for it, which means that he could have, if he wanted to. And so if he could grasp for equality, it would mean that he's not equal already. So this is the argument of the first interpretation. Right. So Jesus did not grasp after the equality with God, but he humbles himself. He's a man. He humbles himself unto death. He empties himself, but only later then to be exalted. Recall that in Paul's letters, he sometimes refers to Jesus, of course, as the second Adam and the perfect man who reverses the curse brought about by the first Adam. So according to this interpretation, Jesus, number one, he's not God from the beginning, right? He is also not really pre-existent, but he is a human, born as a human, later to be exalted after his death and his resurrection. He is exalted, the second part of the poem. He is given high status, right? He is exalted higher than previously. He is given a name above every other name. He is given, as we'll see later, the worship that would be due to God is given to him, and he is made the Kurios, he is made the Lord. Okay, to the glory of God, the Father, or the Creator. So the first interpretation is simple. It says Jesus is human. He gets exalted because he empties himself and he humbles himself as a man. He then becomes divine after the resurrection. But not only just divine, he also goes to the highest form of divinity. But it doesn't say that he becomes equal with God necessarily. It's quite clear that he wasn't equal with God from the poem, and that he doesn't become equal to God in the poem. Everything is still at the end to the glory of God. It's still God that exalts him. So he's lower than God and gets exalted by God. So that's the first view of this poem. It's an adoptionist view, and it is very similar to what we've seen in the other pre-literary portions that we found in Pauline work. Now, the other interpretation is held to by traditional Christians, but I've even found atheists that prefer this interpretation. They just feel it's a more honest one. Let me just go through it quickly. And I'm not here to promote the one or the other. I have my personal preference according to what I can see. And this one isn't it. But this is the one that most of you would know, the most one that you've been taught. It goes like this. Most major scholars consider the poem of Philippians as referring to incarnational Christology. In other words, what they believe this refers to is God, or a divine being, becoming flesh and then being exalted to a much higher status at some point. Now, if you look back at this poem through a Trinitarian viewpoint, you would argue this is God becoming flesh and then going back to becoming God. All right. It's kind of not what the poem says, but that's how you would interpret it. Therefore, depicting Christ then as pre-existent. And so for these people, the form of God here doesn't mean like Adam, and it's got nothing to do with Adam. It's Jesus being divine. So in the form of God, would not mean that he was actually the God, and I was God the Father, God the Creator, but in the form of God would rather point to the fact that he was divine, right? So in other words, he was divine before he became human. Okay. So then he becomes in the fashion of man. Hey! Hey, I've got monkeys fighting here around me. No word. Okay, sorry about that. Um, so right, so he becomes in the fashion of man. This is his humiliation, is coming from the divine realm, becoming flesh. So here they don't see it as a human humbling himself, but as actually divinity humbling themselves to become man. And then is later elevated to a higher status, right? But not just the status of a divine being or the divine. Because remember, in the Greco-Roman world, and even within Judaism, there are many levels of divinity, and so there wasn't just this binary view of God and man, and you are the God or you man. There was lots of levels of divinity. So um, after his resurrection, then he is exalted to a much higher divine status than what he used to have. But still, the poem doesn't say that he becomes equal to God the Father. It still places him in a position of receiving exaltation, even though, as we'll see in a moment, it seems like it exalts him to a place where he could receive the worship that would be normally attributed to God. He still does. All of this still happens to the glory of God. So there's a clear distinction there. So to be stressed is that Christ here is portrayed as pre-existent divine being, but not as the God or the creator. I think that'll be a very hard case to make. I know most Christians interpret it like that, but I just don't think it's right. Not the Father himself, since it is the Father who exalts him, and he is not equal with God before he comes in human flesh. That's also clear because he has the opportunity to grasp for that, right? He wouldn't have that opportunity if he was already that. So thus, it is still a very long way from the doctrine of the Trinity. A lot of Christians don't know what the doctrine of the Trinity is. And I want to spend a little bit of time on this because if I had to ask people what the Trinity is, it is so technical that inevitably the moment you open your mouth, you're getting it wrong. The other day I was confronted by someone who said that I made the statement that we cannot really find the doctrine of the Trinity in the Old Testament. And this person said to me, no, of course we can. There's a Father, there's the Messiah, and there's the Spirit. And that is, unfortunately, the idea that a lot of people have about the Trinity. But the Trinity demands a lot more than the mentioning of a Messiah, the Spirit of God, and God the Father or the Creator. The Trinity requires that the Messiah, number one, is God, which the Old Testament doesn't say. But let's say the Messiah was God, or godlike, or divine. The Trinity requires that all three of these not only are divine, number one, but they are co-equal in divinity. In other words, you can't just say there is a Messiah and a Spirit. It has to explicitly state that they are the same thing and that they have the same level of rank. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Trinity requires that all three of these are co-eternal. In other words, the idea of Father, Son doesn't fit co-eternal ideas very well, because in our simplest understanding of Father and Son, the Son comes forth from the Father. The Father is always first, and then comes the Son. That's how we understand Father and Son. But the Trinity asserts that the Son was co-eternal. In other words, there was never a time in which the Father wasn't, where the Son wasn't also, and the Spirit wasn't also, and that they were all equal. And you're not going to find that in the Old Testament. So it's important to know what the Trinity actually means. And once you have a good grasp on what the Trinity is, then it becomes quite clear that this poem is not a Trinitarian poem. It becomes quite clear that the other pre-literary material that we've looked at, they are not Trinitarian. They do not speak of the Trinity. In fact, some go as far as to say, and which is true, that the word Trinity doesn't really appear in the Bible. We know that, right? But some will go as far as to say that Trinity is a concept that was later developed to make sense of or to harmonize the canonical gospel, or the most accepted, because they were, anyway, the most accepted canonical gospel writings. It was a theory that harmonized all the writings. Okay, so it doesn't mean that in each one of those writings you're going to find Trinitarian ideas. Even Paul, which we're going to discuss in a moment, it's very hard to get to the place where you can say that Paul affirms Trinity as we understand it today. He's on his way. He's further than adoptionism, but he's not quite fully Trinitarian. Okay. There's a couple of reasons why scholars believe that, number one, in the second interpretation, that even though Jesus might be divine before becoming human, he's not equal with God in the poem. We're talking about the poem. The first one, there's a portion that says that he didn't see equality with God as something to grasp after. Right. So then the question becomes, and as often happens with these type of things, is what does the word grasp after mean? And there's a huge debate about what does it mean, because now Trinitarians want it to mean something else, and people who believe that the Trinity was a later development want to see it as something else. Right, I'm just going to go with the German scholar Samuel Vollenweider has shown that the word is almost always used in a wide range of Jewish authors as something that you don't have. You can't grasp for something unless you don't have it. And so the conclusion is that Jesus, at this pre-existent state, does not have equality with God. Otherwise, he would not be able to grasp after it. Okay, so that's the first reason why this poem does not promote a Trinitarian view or the idea that Jesus was equal with God before he became human. The second is we can only make sense of the second half of the poem in which Christ is exalted to an even higher position. We can only make sense of it if we assume that there is nothing higher than God, and that if Jesus then was exalted to be higher than what he used to be, he couldn't have been God, because then he would have to be exalted to something higher than God, and that doesn't exist. So the only conclusion really is that Jesus, in both interpretation, either interpretation, Jesus was either human, exalted to a high level of a divine being, or he was pre-existently divine and then was exalted to a higher divine status, right underneath God, but not equal to God. Okay, so this would have been unfamiliar notion. This would not have been an unfamiliar notion to the minds of the day. I've mentioned this previously. The Greco-Roman and the Judaistic religions understood the divine pyramid as a scale of divine level and order, and not the very binary view of God we have today, which is you're either man or you're God, or you're either man or you're the created God, which is the way we kind of view things today. Okay, so finally in our poem, Christ is Christ exalted to become equal to God? So the wording of the two final stanzas of the poem, verse 10 and 11, we see that he is hyper exalted. And verse 10 and 11, let me read it for you, that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow, of the things in heaven and the things in earth and the things under the earth. Okay, so this is not a statement explicitly as he is now equal to the creator God. This could be a position under God in which he's like a deputy, right? Just thinking logically about this. And that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Kurios, or is the Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Once again, this is not explicitly a statement that Jesus becomes equal to God, but rather that it seems like a position that is still under God, but has control of everything. Okay, so what we do need to note, and what we do need to take recognition of, is this reference, this Philippians 10 to 11, seems to be a reference to original passage, which is found in Isaiah 45, 23 to 22 to 23. And in this passage, it is to Yahweh alone that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess. So let me read this for you. Isaiah 45, 22, 23. Look unto me, and ye be saved, all the ends of the earth. For I am God, and there is no one else. I have sworn by myself, the word is gone out of my mouth in righteousness, and shall not return, that unto me every knee shall bow, and every tongue shall swear. So a lot of Christians take this to be the proof that Jesus became God. But the more logical way to look at this is that Jesus was exalted to a place where he was given by God as a gift, the adoration, or the position that was worthy of the praise equal to that of God. So the second interpretation of the Philippians poem indicates that the very early Christians or followers of Jesus made very audacious claims about him. that he was exalted to be very, very much close to the level of God. Of course, this is a problem because if there was another God who was equal to God, and there's only one God, we have an issue, right? So monotheism seems to be in jeopardy, and this is how the later idea of the Trinity then developed. Christians became more and more claimed that Jesus was God, equal to God from the beginning. Eventually, they had to develop the Trinity because it doesn't really make mathematical sense or logical sense that there are one but three persons, right? You just think about it for a moment. It's not a logical argument. And it's impossible to really talk about it or explain it. That's why a lot of people just call it a mystery. But I've come to realize that really what it is, it's an harmonizing of the scriptures who say different things. All right, so what we have in this poem is we have one of two options. We either have an early adoptionist view, or we have this incarnational view, which is Jesus is pre-existently divine, becomes human, and then God exalts him to the highest possible divine place, but which is not equal to God. So none of these views include a view that Jesus was God or equal to God the Father before his exaltation. I think that's quite clear. This gives us an exciting glimpse into the earliest beliefs of Jesus' followers. It's not necessarily the things that we believe. Even if the first interpretation, and that was the adoptionist interpretation of the poem, is expected or accepted as correct, it still seems like Paul's view, Paul's overarching view of Jesus was incarnational, right? So in other words, what we're saying is that Paul uses a poem that's not necessarily incarnational. It could be adoptionist, and in my view, it should be it's adoptionist view of that fits it better when you look at the other early data. But Paul becomes a new data point on his own when he starts thinking about incarnational Christology. In other words, Paul promotes the idea. Paul, I don't think, was an adoptionist. Paul believed that Jesus was pre-existently divine. I don't think that Paul believed that Jesus was the God and the creator from the beginning, but that he was a divine being under God, then got incarnated into flesh, and then was exalted after that. Okay, so just quickly, and I want to end off today by giving you some of the evidences from Paul's writings. So we're not dealing with the pre-literary materials now. Some of the evidences from Paul's writings that Paul was not an adoptionist, right? Paul seemed to have believed in the incarnation. In other words, Jesus pre-existently divine. So you might say, okay, well, if that is Paul's view, then obviously this poem has to fit in with Paul's view. You might want to make that argument, but the reality is that that's the whole point of a pre-literary piece. It does not always agree with the full and overarching ideas of the writer that implements it. That's actually one of the criteria and how we know that it is pre-literary. Back to Paul. So in Paul, we see a Christology that is incarnational, not adoptional. In other words, Paul, we believe, from his writing, from his early non-disputed writings, it seems like Paul believed that Jesus was divine before he comes to earth. Let's have a look at some of them. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 4. Paul seems to indicate that Jesus, or Christ, was the rock from which the Israelites drank in the wilderness. Now, don't try and explain this to me. I'm not going to explain this to you. Paul believed some stuff. But the point of this is simply to show that Paul believed that Christ existed before the birth of Jesus. In other words, there's the idea in Paul that Jesus wasn't just a human being born normally, but actually he existed before that time. Number 2, 1 Corinthians 15:47. Christ is the second Adam, Paul says, and it says that he is from heaven. And so it seems like Paul did not believe that Jesus was just a normal person born, but that he actually came from heaven. It is interesting that Paul never mentions a virgin birth, but just says born from a woman. That's interesting. Mark and Paul, the earliest two documents, agree on this, that they don't mention a virgin birth at all. But Paul seems to believe that Jesus was from heaven before he was born. Okay, so that's all to show that Jesus was pre-existent. Number 3, Romans 8 verse 3, Paul seems to indicate that God sent Jesus from above. Now for Paul, Paul's worldview was it's not the cosmological view we have today. There's no up and down today in the universe, but Paul's worldview, Paul's cosmology was very, very much still up and down. You go up into the heavens and you come down to the earth. And so it seems here that Paul does believe that Jesus came from the heavenly realm into the earthly realm. Galatians 4 verse 4, Paul writes, when the fullness of time came, God sent his son, and here he says, born of a woman. It makes sense in the light of Paul believing that Jesus was pre-existing and then born into the earth. Why would Paul say that he was born from a woman? That's how every human comes into being, unless Paul believed that he actually came from another realm. Something similar to the angel of the Lord in the Hebrew Bible, possibly. Paul says even higher exalted things about Jesus Christ. Jewish texts understood God's wisdom to be a hypostasis. I don't think I need to go into all of this, but the point is that in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4, Paul describes Christ as the agent of creation. In other words, that God created through Christ, that everything existed through him and by him everything was made. That type of idea. That still doesn't mean that Christ or Jesus, pre-existent, was God, but that he is like in the older Jewish ideas, the wisdom of God was there from the beginning. It's like a hypostasis of God. It's a characteristic of God that almost can stand alone, but it's still God. That type of idea that Jesus or that God through Christ from the beginning made everything. And then lastly, number 6 in Romans 9:5, there's a very hotly debated verse where Paul says he calls Christ according to the flesh, the one who is God over all, blessed forever. Amen. Now, this is a very disputed verse, just simply because the idea of God over all, blessed forever, amen, could actually just be pointing towards God, depending on how you read it in the Greek. Some believe that this is Paul saying that Christ is God. This, I think, or the God, this is the only portion where that type of idea could be promoted strongly. But there's too much dispute here for us to build a theory that Christ was God when everything else points to Christ being a very highly exalted divine being, appointed, exalted by God, given him the worship that would normally be due to God, given him the right to rule as Lord and Kurios. Okay, so does Paul call Jesus God? Yes, in a certain sense. Paul does believe that Jesus is divine, but it doesn't seem like Paul calls Jesus the God, the creator God. So it seems unlikely that Paul believed that Jesus was God the Father. It seems like he believes that Jesus was some type of a divine being before coming into the world. He was eventually exalted to be some equality to God, some sense equal to God, becoming worthy of God's honor and worship, as we've seen. And so Paul calls Jesus God, as he does in Romans 9 verse 5. This tradition makes it appear its appearance later, clearly and forcefully in the gospel according to John. So I'm going to leave this here today, and then next week I'd like to summarize all the findings we have. I'd like to present a timeline of how these things, according to the data points, they seem to have developed. And at the end, our conclusion is a very simple one. I won't go into all of it now, but simply that the first follower of Jesus had a particular view that might not agree with the views of the later gospel writers, because even the gospel writers themselves differ on many points when it comes to Christology, especially when we come to the Gospel of John, which is a very high Christology. Of course, John indicates Jesus was there from that God in the beginning was the Word, that type of idea, something you don't find in the other Gospels. But we also have Paul, and we need to take cognizance that Paul is actually the earliest writer. So we're going to put a kind of a timeline together to see how these things fit together and how the data produces what. Data produces a development of the ideas of Jesus. And so I've come to the conclusion that the first followers of Jesus would definitely did not believe in the Trinity. That to me has become absolutely clear. And it's also become clear to me that the Trinity is something that developed over a long time. And only really in the 4th century we see the conclusion of that. And that many of the early writers of the New Testament, including the Gospels, including Paul, did not hold to the Trinity, but some other form of Christology. All right. Thank you so much for being with me today. Have an awesome day. I'll see you next week. Cheers.